Hello, welcome to No Frills ASMR. Today we're going to read a little bit of the adventures of Ulysses. This is a vintage book, a scholastic book. It says by Bernard Evslin, but I noticed somebody wrote Homer. Credit where credit's due. This is copyright in 1969. And this is pretty cool. They put a little map in here of where Ulysses went. So while we read, maybe we can look and see where we are on the map. Prologue. Do we read the prologue? I know most people do. I don't ever read the prologue. Let's skip to the good stuff. Ships and men. After Troy was burned, so this is after the war in Troy, he's coming home to his family. He's been gone for a very long time. Ulysses sailed for home with 3 ships holding 50 men each. 3,000 years ago, ships were very different. Through the years, they have changed much more than the men who sailed them. These beaked warships, used by the pirate kingdoms of the Middle Sea, were like no vessel you have ever seen. Imagine a very long, narrow rowboat with 20 oars on each side. I don't know if you can see the picture there. There's oars. The timbers of the bow curve sharply to a prow, and this prow grows longer and sharper, becomes in fact a long polished shaft tipped by a knife-edged brass spearhead. This was called the ram, the chief weapon of ancient warships. In battle, the opposing ships spun about each other, swooping forward, twirling on their beams, darting backwards, their narrow hulls allowing them to backwater very swiftly. The object was to ram the enemy before he rammed you. And to ram first was the only defense, for the brass beak of the ramming ship sheared easily through the timbers of its victim, knocking a huge hole in the hull and sinking it before its men could jump overboard. Oh my goodness. I'm going to take a little sip of water. I have a little bit of a cold, so. These warships were also equipped with sail and mast, using only for voyaging, never in battle. A square sail and a short mast held fast by oxhide stays. So that's right there, that part. The sail was raised only for a fair wind, or could be tilted slightly for a quartering wind, but was useless against headwinds. This meant that these ships were almost always at the mercy of the weather and were often blown off course. Another thing that made them unfit for long voyages was the lack of cargo space. Only a few days' supply of food and water could be carried, leaving space for no other cargo. This is why these fighting ships tried to hug the coast and avoid the open sea. Ulysses' problem was made worse by victory. When Troy was sacked, he and his men captured a huge booty: gold and jewels, silk and furs. And after 10 years of war, the men refused to leave any loot behind. This meant that each of his ships could carry food and water for very few days. This greed for treasure caused many of his troubles at first, but then troubles came so thick and fast that no one could tell what caused them. Hardships were simply called bad luck, or the anger of the gods. But bad luck made good stories. That's something I say sometimes. Like, yeah, that sucks, but you got a story out of it. The Siconians. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but hopefully. And there's the picture. It kind of looks like a woman. Sorry, excuse me. Oh, look, there's a woman here and a woman here. They're kind of like mermaids. Yeah, I think they're like mermaids. The voyage began peacefully. A fair northeast wind blew, filling the sails of the little fleet and pushing it steadily homeward. The wind freshened at night, and the three ships scudded along joyfully under a fat moon. On the morning of the second day, Ulysses saw a blue haze of smoke and a glint of a white stone. He put in toward shore and saw a beautiful little town. The men stared in amazement at the city without walls, rich with green parks and grazing cattle. Its people strolling about in white tunics. 10 years of war had made Ulysses' men as savage as wolves. Everyone, not a shipmate, was an enemy. To meet was to fight. Property belonged to the winner. Ulysses stood in the bow, shading his eyes with his hand, gazing at the city. A tough, crafty old warrior named Eurylochus stood behind him. "We attack, do we not?" he asked. "The city lies there defenseless. We can take it without losing a man." "Yes, it looks tempting," said Ulysses, "but the wind blows fair and good fortune attends us. Perhaps it will spoil our luck to stop." "But this fat little city has been thrown into our laps by the gods too," said Eurylochus, "and they grow angry when men refuse their gifts. It would be bad luck not to attack." Ulysses heard the fierce murmur of his men behind him and felt in his veins the burning of their greed. He hailed the other ships and gave orders, and the three black-hulled vessels swerved toward shore and nosed into the harbor, swooping down upon the white city like wolves upon a sheepfold. They landed on the beach. The townsfolk fled before them into the hills. Ulysses did not allow his men to pursue them, for there was no room on the ship for slaves. From house to house, the armed men went, helping themselves to whatever they wanted. Afterward, they piled the booty in great heaps upon the beach. Then Ulysses had them round up a herd of the plump, swaying, crook-horned cattle and offer 10 bulls in sacrifice to the gods. Later, they built huge bonfires on the beach, roasted the cattle, and had a great feast. But while the looting and feasting was going on, the men of the city had withdrawn into the hills and called together their kinsmen of villages, the Ciconians. Sorry, I read somewhere. Of the villages, the Ciconians, and began preparing for battle. Not sure what I'm reading wrong there. They were skillful fighters, these men of the hills. They drove brass war chariots that had long blades attached to the wheels, and these blades whirled swiftly as the wheels turned, scything down the foe. They gathered by the thousands in overwhelming force and stormed down out of the hills onto the beach. Ulysses' men were full of food and wine, unready to fight, but he had posted sentries who raised a shout when they saw the Ciconians coming down from the hills in the moonlight. Ulysses raged among his men, slapping them with the flat of his sword, driving the fumes of wine out of their heads. His great racketeering battle cry roused those he could not whip with his sword. The men closed ranks and met the Ciconians at spear point. The Hellenes retreated slowly, leaving their treasure where it was heaped upon the beach, and, keeping their line unbroken, made for their ships. Ulysses chose 2 of his strongest men and bade them lift thick timber upon their shoulders. He sat astride this timber, high enough to shoot his arrows over the heads of men. He was the most skillful archer since Hercules. He aimed only at the chariot horses and aimed not to kill but to cripple, so that the horses fell in their traces, and their furious flailing and kicking broke the enemy's advance. Thus the Hellenists were able to reach their ships and roll them into the water, leap into the rowers' benches and row away. But 18 men were left dead on the beach, 6 from each ship, and there was scarcely a man unwounded. Oh, dear me. Eurylochus threw himself on his knees before Ulysses and said, I advised you badly, O chief. We have angered the gods. Perhaps, if you kill me, they will be appeased. 18 dead are enough for one night, said Ulysses. Our luck has changed, but what has changed can change again. Rise and go about your duties. The ships had been handled roughly in the swift retreat from the Ciconian beach. Their hulls had been battered by axes and flung spears, and they had sprung small leaks. The wind had faded to a whisper, and the men were forced to row with water sloshing around their ankles. Ulysses saw his ships were foundering, and that he would have to empty the holds. Food could not be spared, nor water. The only thing that could go was the treasure taken from Troy. The men groaned and tore at their beards as they saw the gold and jewels and bales of fur and silk being dropped overboard. But Ulysses cast over his own share of the treasure first, and his was the largest share. So the men had to bite back their rage and keep on rowing. As the necklace, bracelets, rings, and brooches sank slowly, winking their jewels like drowned fires, a strange thing happened. A shoal of naiads, beautiful water nymphs, were drawn by the flash of the jewels. They dived after the bright baubles and swam alongside the ships, calling to the men, singing, tweaking the oars out of their hands, for they were sleek, mischievous creatures who loved jewels and strangers. Some of them came riding dolphins, and in the splashing silver veil of the spray, the men thought they saw beautiful girls with fish tails. This is probably how the first report of mermaids arose. Poseidon, god of the sea, was wakened from sleep by the sound of this activity. When he saw what was happening, his green beard bristled with rage, and he said to himself, Can it be? Are these warriors whom I helped in their siege of Troy? Is this their gratitude, trying to steal my naiads from me? I'll teach them manners. Uh-oh. He whistled across the horizon to his son, Aeolus, keeper of the winds, who twirled his staff and sent a northeast gale skipping across the sea. It pounced upon the little fleet and scattered the ships like twigs. Ulysses clung to the helm, trying to hold the kicking tiller, trying to shout over the wind. There was nothing to do but ship the masts and let the wind take them. And the wind, in one huge gust of fury, drove them around Cythera, the southernmost of their home islands, into the open waters of the southwest quarter of the Middle Sea, toward the hump of Africa called Libya. Why am I saying that wrong? So, those little mermaids, that's what these were. Interesting. The lotus eaters. I don't know, should I save this? Let's see how many pages it is. I like the chapters are pretty short, so we can do this one. Look how scary. Looks kind of scary, you guys. Oh my god. What is it? We'll find out. Now, At this time, the shore of Libya was known as the land where Morpheus play. Who was Morpheus? He was a young god, son of Hypnos, god of sleep, and nephew of Hades. It was his task to fly around the world from nightfall to dawn, scattering sleep. His father, Hypnos, mixed the colors of sleep for him, making them dark and thick and sad. For he said, "It is a little death you lay upon man each night, my son, to prepare him for the kingdom of death." Wow. But his aunt, Persephone, sewed him a secret pocket full of bright things and said, "It is not death you scatter, but repose. Hang the walls of sleep with bright pictures so that man may not know death before he dies." These bright pictures were called dreams, and Morpheus became fascinated by the way a little corner of man's mind remained awake in sleep and played with the colors he had hung, mixing them, pulling them apart, making new pictures. It seemed to him that these fantastic colored shadows the sleepers painted were the most beautiful, most puzzling things he had ever seen, and he wanted to know more about how they came to be. He went to Persephone and said, "I need a flower that makes sleep. It must be purple and black, but there should be one petal streaked with fire red, the petal to make dreams." Persephone smiled and moved her long white hand in the air. Between her fingers, a flower blossomed. She gave it to him. "Here it is, Morpheus, black and purple like sleep, with one petal of fire red for dreams. We will call it Lotus." Morpheus took the flower and planted it in Libya, where it is always summer. The flower grew in clusters, smelling deliciously of honey. The people ate nothing else. They slept all the time, except when they were gathering flowers. Morpheus watched over them, reading their dreams. Get a sip of water. Okay. It was towards Lotus Land that Ulysses and his men were blown by the gale. The wind fell while they were still offshore. The sky cleared, the sea calmed, and a hot sun beat down. To Ulysses, dizzy with fatigue, weak with hunger, the sky and the water and the air between seemed to flow together in one hot blueness. He shook his head, trying to shake away the hot blue haze, and growled to his men to unship the oars and row towards land. The exhausted men bent to the oars, and the ships crawled over the fire-blue water. With their last strength, they pulled the ship on the beach, past the high tide mark, and then lay down and went to sleep. As they slept, the lotus eaters came out of the forest. Their arms were heaped with flowers, which they piled about the sleeping men in great blue and purple bouquets, so that they might have flowers to eat when they awoke. For these people were very gentle and hospitable. The men awoke and smelled the warm honey smell of the flowers, and ate them in great handfuls like honeycomb, and fell asleep again. Morpheus hovered over their sleeping men and read their dreams. "Oh boy, these men have done terrible things," the god whispered to himself. "Their dreams are full of gold and blood and fire. Such sleep will not rest them." And he mixed them some cool green and silver dreams of home. The nightmares faded. Wounded Trojans stopped screaming. Troy stopped burning. They saw their wives smile, heard their children laugh, saw the green wheat growing in their own fields. They dreamed of home, awoke and were hungry, ate the honeyed lotus flowers and fell into a deeper sleep. Then Morpheus came to Ulysses, who was stretched out on the sand, a little apart from the rest. He studied his face, the wide brow, the sunken eyes, the hair threaded with gray, the jutting chin, and he said to himself, "This man is a hero. Terrible are his needs, sudden his deeds, and his dreams must be his own. I cannot help him." So Morpheus mixed no colors for Ulysses' sleep, but let him dream his own dreams and read them as they came. He hovered above the sleeping king and could not leave. "What monsters he makes," he said to himself. "Look at that giant with the single eye in the middle of his forehead, and that terrible spider woman with all those legs. Ah, the things he dreams. This angry sleeper. What bloody mouths, what masts falling, sails ripping, what rocks and reefs, what shipwrecks, how many deaths." Ulysses awoke, choking, out of a terrible nightmare. It seemed to him that in his sleep he had seen the whole voyage laid out before him, had seen his ship sinking, his men drowning. Monsters had crowded about him, clutching, writhing. He sat up and looked about. His men lay asleep among heaped flowers. As he watched, one opened his eyes, raised himself on an elbow, took a handful of flowers, stuffed them into his mouth, and immediately fell asleep again. Ulysses smelled the honey sweetness and felt an overpowering hunger. He took some of the flowers and raised them to his mouth. As their fragrance grew stronger, he felt his eyelids drooping, and his arms grew heavy, and he thought, "It is these flowers that are making us sleep. Their scent alone brings sleep. I must not eat them." But he could not put them down. His hand would not obey him. Exerting all the bleak force of his will, he grasped his right hand with his left as if it belonged to someone else, and one by one forced open his fingers and let the flower fall. Then he dragged himself to his feet and walked slowly into the sea. He went under and arose snorting. His head had cleared. But when he went up on the beach, the sweet fragrance rose like an ether and made him dizzy again. "I must work swiftly," he said. One by one, he carried the sleeping men to the ships and propped them on their benches. His strength was going. The honey smell was invading him, making him droop with sleep. He took his knife and, cutting sharp splinters of wood to prop open his eyelids, staggered back among the men. He worked furiously now, lifting them on his shoulders, carrying them two at a time, throwing them into the ships. Finally, the beach was cleared, the men lulled, sleeping upon the benches. Then, all by himself, using his last strength, he pushed the ships into the water. When the ships were afloat in the shallow water, he lashed one to another with rawhide line, his own ship in front. Then he raised his sail and took the helm. The wind was blowing from the southwest. It filled his sail. The line grew taut. The file of ships moved away from Lotus Land. The men began to awake from their dreams of home and found themselves upon the empty sea again. But the long sleep had rested them, and they took up their tasks with new strength. Ulysses kept the helm, grim and unsmiling, for he knew that what he had seen painted on the walls of his sleep was meant to come true, and that he was sailing straight into a nightmare. Oh my gosh. Well, I think that's all for today, guys. Let me know if you enjoyed that. We'll read more. We are that far through. So